the first market bubble in recorded history.
The tulip mania is often said to be the first major stock market bubble that ever existed. What you're seeing here is people who have no real idea of what a bubble is or that stock markets can go down as well as up.
It would shake an entire nation.
Well, one of the most striking characteristics of the development of the Dutch economy and Dutch society that grew out of that was the development of a very wealthy upper middle class who were based on trading. They were merchants, essentially.
They were very important to the whole story, I think.
These were people who were making a living, but now with the trade that was taking place in that region, they suddenly had excess money.
This again is a phenomenon which is fairly unique to the Netherlands. The Dutch merchant class was wealthier than equivalents in other countries.
What happens when the bubble pops?
The banking system gets involved and finances a big boom like we had during the real estate boom recently. It could involve every person in the economy and every business in the economy as the entire banking system is brought to its knees.
The extent of the mania and the extent of the sudden crash that took place at the end of it was particularly sharp and marked.
It's isolated to a particular region and to a particular product. It could be that a number of people make a lot of money during the boom and a number of people lose a lot of money during the bust.
The Dutch, they call it the Dutch golden age.
In order to understand the Dutch tulip mania, one must first understand the tulip. That leads to a stunning place.
Well, the key thing to understand about the tulip is that it's not a European flower. It's actually an incomer. It was first found and grown in the mountains of Central Asia.
In their native lands, Turkey, Kazakhstan, the Tibetan, Himalayan area, they would grow wild on gravel scree, which is just loose gravel. Not soil, not sand, but perfect drainage.
The Turks became interested in the tulip, as far as we know, around about the 14th century, 15th century. We know that there were fashions for embroidering tulips on clothing, sometimes even the underwear worn by warriors, for example.
They would have been a very small tulip. The blossoms would have been about the size of a dime to a nickel total, and only stood about 2 or 3 inches tall.
Oh, they were quite small with just wispy little blooms. Then they were hybridized to have bigger blooms, but they were thought to be so exotic.
And in a sense, the simplicity at that early stage was part of their appeal because they're seen as sort of symbolic of a number of things. Spring is the most obvious one, but also of passion. It came to Europe for the first time in the middle of the 16th century, and so the key to understand here is that it's a novelty. It's something that's new, it's unusual, it's very beautiful, and that really is the reason why there's such high demand for the tulip.
It is the mid-16th century, and the northern Dutch provinces are rebelling against Spain.
Well, the tulip first came to the Netherlands in the early stages of the Dutch Revolt, which is an 80-year war for independence between the northern provinces of the Netherlands and Spain. It's to do with things like excessive taxation.
So a lot of wealth was pouring into the Netherlands from other countries, and of course that wealth would come in the form of silver. They would coin that silver into coins of the Netherlands, Dutch coins, and so there was a lot of gold and silver flowing into that country.
Would you rather have an economy with or without checking accounts? It just facilitates the trade. It's a way to ramp up the ease with which people make transactions.
The Spanish in the Americas have discovered vast new silver mines, both in Peru and in Mexico, and they're importing huge quantities of silver into Europe, which gives the European economy a gigantic boost, and it's crucial for the Dutch that this happens.
It was a country of ports. If you look at maps of the Netherlands, they're literally surrounded by water, and so they were a great location in terms of that. The people there were very clever and loved to trade, loved to do business. It was a cultural thing for them.
There's not a lot of direct Dutch contact with the areas where the tulip was grown in the 15th, 16th centuries, which is essentially the Ottoman Empire. There would be embassies, not just from the point of view of trade, but also from the military point of view. And it's these missions that are based in Istanbul that first notice the tulip and become familiar with it.
Despite the turmoil in Europe, a young French botanist was about to receive a package that would change Dutch history forever. His name was Carolus Clusius.
Clusius was one of the best-known botanists in Europe at this time. He had a job as the head of the botanical garden at the University of Leiden, and one of the main things that he was active in was trading and acquiring different sorts of flowers, bulbs, seeds and so on, using his network of correspondence to search out novelties and then propagating them in his gardens and then spreading around the new plants that he was growing as well. So he's really sitting at the centre of the development of the very early stages of the tulip trade in Holland.
Clusius's largest contribution to the tulip mania was his correspondence.
Well, the European postal system in the 16th and 17th centuries was actually quite sophisticated. It was possible to send via a sort of courier system, essentially, which would be on horseback, quite significant packages, very securely through relatively good roads at an affordable price. The importance of the network that Clusius specifically has, of course, is that it has heavy links to the wealthiest classes of Europe. So, humanist intellectuals tend to have patrons, for example. They're the people who are funding all of this academic research. You end up with this becoming something which is known to a very high-ranking group of very wealthy people in Northern Europe.
It's very easy to get distracted by the flowers. It never was about the flowers. This was about the bulb as an investment good.
The bulb is the storage unit that has the roots and the potential of the stem and flower. If you take a tulip bulb and slice it right down the middle, you can see with a microscope that tiny little flower all folded up like an origami project in the middle of the bulb.
Tulip bulb is kind of shaped like a drop of rain, wide at the base and has a point to it. The offset is when the stalk starts to grow off the bottom or out of the side compared to straight up the center through the point.
The reason that they were valuable is because to produce more tulips from seeds takes about 7 to 10 years. If you plant the bulbs will produce offshoots of 2 or 3, and then you could double your amount of bulbs every 2 or 3 years.
This was not like any other crop. The tulip bulb is an investment good that produces additional tulips.
A flower will only be in bloom for a matter of a few days or weeks. The bulb is permanent and it continues to exist after the flower has faded away for the year. The bulb makes the commodity something which is tradable, and that's its importance. They became infected with a virus, which is called the tobacco mosaic virus. This is what causes them to break out in particularly vivid and bright colours and stripes and flares of colour in the ways that we see in paintings of the tulips of the tulip mania.
Once it was infected with that virus, you weren't going to get many blooms or many offsets.
Upon appointment by Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II in 1573, Clusius's tulip gardens across the provinces would begin to face theft in his absence.
The people who had the tulips initially were the rich people and the botanists.
Root cutters who traveled around, these were kind of low lives at the time, but who traveled around and would steal flowers out of the gardens of some of the wealthy. And in fact, it was the root cutters who made it possible for the tulips to spread across the provinces.
With his stolen tulips now being sold to a variety of buyers, Clusius's misfortune had set in motion a series of events that would culminate in the Dutch tulip mania.
You can have a situation where there might be only 10 or 20 examples of this particular variety of tulip in existence, and that makes them vastly in demand and potentially worth a vast amount of money.
Not even the keenest of Dutch businessmen, whatever tulip fanatics though they were, could have guessed what was to come.
Well, the interesting thing about the way in which the tulip was first grown in the Netherlands by members of the regent class is this really is very much, a hobby. What you can see is that when these early trades, the very small number that do occur, the news of that starts to get out. That's where the avarice begins to come in.
The middle class at that time would have been people like weavers and shop owners. These were people who were making a living. But now, with the trade that was taking place in that region, they suddenly had excess money.
Essentially, the Dutch had what we might call the first modern economy. They were trading extensively with the Far East, what was known as the rich trades, the trade in spices. So they were bringing in vast amounts of money relative to other nations.
Initially, many of the middle class had excess money. They were taking this excess money and putting it to work in these tulips. But as the mania started to evolve and they saw opportunities to make more money, they started borrowing against their assets. So some of these middle class were literally borrowing money from others against their looms.
With Spanish pressure mounting on the southern provinces, the North would see a massive influx of artisans beginning in the 1590s. Without modern exchanges, tulip bulb traders would do business in the smoky backrooms of local taverns. They would come to be known as colleges.
Essentially, it was a trade that took place amongst lower class people who headquartered themselves in taverns, in inns.
These people would gather in the pubs, their local pubs. They would get their alcohol and maybe some food, and they would start drinking. And then the trading would begin. And so the trading would begin with the simplest, most boring of the bulbs usually. And these would be sort of the lowest cost. And they would start their Dutch auction and sort of establish the price for the day. And then they would move to the more valuable bulbs, and from that point on for the evening.
Colleges were not sophisticated trading arenas. There were no margin requirements.
The middle class in Holland at that point in time was experiencing rapid growth in income, probably unlike they'd ever experienced before. They were getting a taste of the good life. You can imagine that they looked to the upper classes and saw that the way that they lived would want to be able to have some of the things that they had. The Dutch are, even today, people who love to trade, who love to do business, and are very creative financially. So this brought that class of people into a new world that they were, I think, were really enjoying and were excited to be a part of.
They would typically be, well known to each other. They'd be, fellow townspeople. They would possibly be involved in similar trades. A number of people who became involved in the tulip trade were artisans, essentially, who had sold or mortgaged the tools of their trade to acquire some capital to get involved. Weavers in the pamphlets that we have from that time are very closely associated with the tulip trade, and a large number of weavers seem to have sold or mortgaged their looms.
By the mid-1630s, artisans would be giving up their tools in order to participate in the mania of tulip bulb trading.
To be invited to have a seat in the stock market, that's something which is completely out of the reach of a typical Dutch tulip trader. These are low-class artisans. They are looking at a financial mechanism they have no hope of ever accessing. They're aping its mechanisms, and they're aping the way in which it works with something they can, in fact, lay their hands on. So the tulip is really something which is not traded at all on the Dutch stock market, but comes centre to a completely different sort of mirror trade, effectively, in the period of the tulip mania. The impression that I get is that we're talking about a period now where the tulip has been in the Netherlands for 20 or 30 years. The number of tulips, therefore, available within the Netherlands has gone up fairly substantially. The number of different varieties that have been propagated and grown has exponentially increased.
There is good money to be made in the tulip trade.
There's a story, I believe, about a house being purchased for 3 of these bulbs. And I've been to the Netherlands and seen that house. It's quite a mansion.
However, as the mania begins to boil, the traders start to get overzealous.
Where 1 or 2 of these most beautiful but rarest plants are sold for sums that are expressed at the time as 3 times the price of the most valuable house in Amsterdam, for example.
The bulbs would have been traded during the summer and in the early fall. But so if you had gone into the market, you would have seen boxes with bulbs in them, and people would buy and sell those bulbs. But by mid to late November, the bulbs in Holland and the bulbs all over Europe would have been planted,
which limited the trading to the summer months. And once the financial innovation of the futures contracts was introduced, then they could trade them throughout the winter months when the bulbs were underground.
What actually is happening is that the bulbs are still in the ground. They're being cultivated by specialist gardeners, and what's being traded is actually a promissory note that says, I own this bulb in this garden in this location, I'm transferring that ownership to you. And you're ending up with promissory notes that have a whole series of these transactions scrawled on them in the colleges, and the bulb is traded from one person to another person. The liability that goes with it to actually settle the bill on the promissory note and pay for the bulb when it's finally flowering is also transferred.
A promissory note is the same as it is today. It was basically a promise to pay. Somebody who, in this case, you knew, somebody in your community almost for sure, would go to sell you the futures for these aces, and you wanted to buy them, but you didn't have enough money today. And you didn't want to give all the money because they haven't delivered the bulbs. So the idea was, I promise to pay you come May, but you're going to deliver these bulbs. And in exchange for that, I'm going to give you, I don't know, maybe 10% down or 5% down. And then when you deliver the bulb, I'll pay the balance. Many of these people never intended to pay the balance. They intended to buy the note, hold it for a few weeks, and then sell it in one of the colleges and make a profit.
And the pieces of paper, these promissory notes, became a form of money.
At the onset of the winter of 1636, individual promissory notes were changing hands almost 10 times a day. However, this particular winter would lead to the eventual decline of the tulip bulb market in the United Provinces. Doctors Thomas and McClure from Ball State University recently presented a paper on the tulip mania. They refer to the bulbs as sequestered capital.
The Austrian theory has a thing called the structure of capital in it, and across this structure of capital, the prices coordinate the production process by which you get from a beginning thing to an ending thing. But the problem with the theory is that the missing piece, it's sort of almost a Bermuda Triangle in their theory, is this missing piece. There's this signalless component, and that's when capital is sequestered.
If we look at the structure of capital and how capital is invested, from the very, very earliest stages, it would be research and development. And at the research and development stage, everything is secret. Keep it quiet. We don't want anybody to know what we're doing. When the product is sufficiently completed that you're ready to deliver it onto the market, it emerges out of that time period and becomes visible. And at that point in time, now your competitors see what you're doing. You see who else is in the market. You have signals from the buyers as to how much it's going to be worth. And very quickly the market will adjust. And people will adjust how much they're going to produce and at what prices.
In order to understand the idea of sequestered capital, you must first understand the life cycle of a tulip.
Depending on the variety of the bulb, it will start to send up a shoot in early December from the bulb, but not break the top of the soil. The breaking of the soil will come usually in March or April, and then it will bloom in late April or May.
From there, it'll bloom probably about a week to week and a half per variety, and it'll start to die off, which will start your cycle all over again.
But during that earliest stage, when capital is sequestered and it's hidden, we don't have those signals. Now what happens is that there's one signal coming in, which is coming from the consumer saying we want to buy these, right? And everybody in there is getting that same signal, but they don't know what the other ones are doing. Okay, this would be like the farmers. I know there's a demand for tulips. I'm going to grow a lot of tulips. I'm going to put a lot of tulips in the ground. In fact, I'm going to put every tulip I can get my hand on in the ground. But you're not going to have the ability to go around and count how many tulips your neighbors have planted or the people in the nearby town have planted. So you don't know the magnitude of tulip bulbs that are in the ground that year. And when those bulbs all came up pretty much at the same time in February, now the signal's there. And that is what caused the collapse.
With winter trading of contracts in full swing, hundreds of florists and bulb growers continue to do business, totally unaware of the rude awakening on the horizon. It's the first Tuesday of February, 1637. The members of Haarlem's college have just begun the day's auctions, but no one is placing any bids.
And those people, as those sprouts came up, they would have realized, they would have come to the realization that there were more sprouts than they had ever seen before.
You couldn't help but look out and see the crops that would be growing at that point in time. And of course the fields would be empty, except for some snow and dirt, until that first week of February, when suddenly you would see, as far as your eye could see, tulips emerging. And it was in Haarlem then that, on I believe the 5th of February, that the first big collapse occurred. They bought the first batch of bulbs up for sale, started at a pretty high price, as they usually did, and they had no takers. And then the Dutch auction started to reduce the price and kept going down, and nobody would buy it at any price. And that signal then among those people was, we have a problem.
You know, we know that the collapse happened very quickly within individual towns, which certainly suggests an element of panic and the transmission of that news fairly rapidly.
The prices were not going to be sustainable in the market. They would have come to that realization pretty quickly.
We have to bear in mind that these are guys who've been involved in the trade for, maybe not a very long time, but even if you've only been involved for a few weeks or months, you've had time to involve yourself in multiple auctions, multiple exchanges. You hold some promissory notes on tulips, which you had been holding on to on the assumption that the price would continue to go up and you're going to make a profit on it. If the price starts to go down, then you're suddenly very highly liable for large sums of money that you simply don't have.
Without modern communication technologies, it would take the rest of the United Provinces a few days to learn of what happened in Haarlem.
Most of these would probably be due the 1st of May, when the bulbs would be taken out of the ground, and then they would be able to then sell what they had. But at this point in time, with the market collapsed, people were panicked. People were concerned because they knew they weren't going to be able to pay the balance, and that what they were going to get wasn't worth what they were paying.
By the second week of February, there were no more colleges trading these contracts. The market just vanished. These people would have been looking for a way out.
As soon as you introduce the possibility that prices might go down, that you might end up liable for some of these large sums of money, the trust can evaporate very quickly. The collapse is something which is very highly dramatic, much, much more so than, for example, the Wall Street crash of 1929. We're talking about the difference between the value of a commodity going down by 2/3 over 2 years, in the case of Wall Street, to the value of a commodity going down by 99% in 2 weeks.
With all the previous season's contracts due soon, florists don't have the money to pay for their orders.
The connoisseurs at the top end have multiple resources. The tulip investments they have are a very small proportion of their total worth. They are unaffected by this trade, and they are unaffected by the crash. Everybody else is. There are 2 other classes who are involved. The growers are professional gardeners who are essentially keepers of these assets. They're the people who physically control them, and are expecting to get paid for their work in guarding and protecting and growing the tulips by the people who own them at the time that the flowers, the bulbs, are lifted out of the ground. The other people who are involved are the traders themselves, who typically don't know how to grow a tulip and probably have never seen, in fact, many of the tulips that they own in any state at all, even as bulbs. And they are liable to pay the growers for their work, and they are also liable to pay each other for the various promissory notes they hold.
There were no margin requirements. And again, I think it's because of the newness of this financial instrument in the case of this commodity.
Your sole way of actually acquiring that money is by calling in the debts that are owed to you by other tulip traders on other promissory notes. And you see these guys panicking, running, heading for the hills at the same time. So there is a sort of double catastrophe happening to your worth at that same time. Your own worth is going down. Your ability to call in value from other people is evaporating almost within your sight. Well, the collapse of the Dutch tulip trade is perhaps the element of the bubble which is least characteristic of what we now see today. The Dutch did have a very highly developed court system. You could, in theory, enforce contracts through that system, but the people involved in the tulip trade were not the sort of people who would be involved in court cases normally in Holland.
You'd have to have some kind of compensation for the people who had done the planting and the cultivating.
The balance essentially between the money that an individual trader owed to somebody else, the money that was owed to him, was probably in many cases relatively close, and so the amount of catastrophe that came out of this was actually considerably less.
In the blink of an eye, what was indeed a huge fortune on paper had bloomed into a disaster. In the winter months of 1636 to 1637, the price of tulip bulbs had surely increased tenfold, and subsequently decreased tenfold. Tulip mania was over.
The most obvious long-term effect was actually on the popularity of the tulip as a flower in the Netherlands. It acquired a pretty unsavoury reputation. Again, you could see a significant religious and moral dimension to this, because the sin of greed was clearly exemplified in the tulip mania. And so the idea of trading and buying and selling and growing even tulips became very unfashionable in the Netherlands for quite a considerable time.
The connoisseurs, having never been in it for profit, continued to trade revered bulbs for another 100 years.
We know very little about what the connoisseurs thought about the tulip trade. One might imagine they would find it quite vulgar, but we don't know that for sure. What we certainly can say is that the people who became involved in the tulip trade are pure traders. They want to actually, acquire wealth, not tulips. They have no use for tulip bulbs in the way that the connoisseurs did, as something which has value in terms of its beauty. They very typically wouldn't have a garden to grow it in. At the very top end of the trade with the connoisseurs, this trade seems to go on more or less, as it had done before.
Traders would have a harder time adjusting to a post-mania United Provinces.
Their dreams of wealth were probably evaporated.
Effectively, it would appear pretty much just goes back to their original trade. Now, this isn't that easy, because you've mortgaged or sold your goods. You've got to acquire the money to reacquire, or at least loan the tools of some other trade. One of the main myths about the Dutch tulip mania was that it was intimately connected to the Dutch economy as a whole, and that the crash of the tulip bubble caused a major economic depression in the Netherlands. The research that I've done shows that wasn't the case, that the tulip bubble was actually completely separate, essentially, to the mainstream of the Dutch economy.
Well, tulip mania has been studied a lot, and there's a lot of information about it, considering how long ago that it was. It all took place in one little area in just about 6 months time period, and it had all the elements that we were looking for. It had economic growth, a high period of economic growth. It had the involvement of the middle class. It had financial innovations, and it had a very colorful and exciting product that people were focused on.
Anything that comes up with so much beauty. I think that the tulip is the Dutch icon, along with windmills and wooden shoes.
In a flash, it was there and it was gone. Analyzed for centuries, the tulip mania remains one of the oldest examples of a market bubble. From historians to economists alike, all affirm its depth and zeal. Despite its age, this is a story that will not soon be forgotten.
Jalouse et glorieux de ma félicité, n'attendez plus que je me